Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our July Social Justice Preacher Series. Just a little bit about Sister Reach. First of all, I'm Elise Salisbury, Director of Programming at Sister Reach. Sister Reach was founded in October 2011 here in Memphis, Tennessee. Sister Reach is a grassroots 501c3 nonprofit that supports the reproductive autonomy of women and teens of color, poor and rural women, LGBTQIA+ people, and our families through the framework of reproductive justice. Our mission is to empower our base to live healthy lives, raise healthy families, and live in healthy and sustainable communities. We achieve our work through a four-pronged strategy of education, policy and advocacy, a culture shift and harm reduction, and our reach is local, regional, national, as well as international. We seek to increase awareness and impact our supporters through centering the voices, experiences, and leadership of those most marginalized, curating community-centered discussions and trainings to enhance and engage knowledge and base building among the people we serve, and strategically engage stakeholders who work aligned with our mission and vision and expands our capacity to reach our base and achieve human rights. This month, our guest is Imam Daayiee Abdullah. He is founder and ED of Mecca Institute, and author of Progressive Islam, The Rich Liberal Ideas of the Muslim Faith, heads a Muslim online progressive Islamic think tank and theological seminary. Mecca has a research center, publishing house, Mecca Institute Publishing LLC, and a progressive Muslim community portal, Mecca Institute Community Portal, where we promote an inclusive Quranic liberation theology through its Muslim chaplaincy program. Imam Daayiee lectures nationally and internationally on revisions of Islamic theological thought and Islam law, utilizing the UNDHR as a filter, intrafaith and interfaith networking. Imam Daayiee provides pastoral counseling for Muslim youth, adults, their families and friends, and has performed same-sex, opposite-sex, and interfaith marriages for Muslims of diverse backgrounds. Reach him at daayiee@gmail.com. Help me welcome today Imam Daayiee Abdullah, our July Social Justice Preacher Series guest for the topic, Progressive Islam and Reformation. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome again to our Social Justice Preacher Series. Thank you so much for joining us today. So if you will, introduce yourself, tell us what you'd like us to know.
Okay, well, assalamu alaikum and peace and blessings to everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. And I think that this topic is something that most people who understand, at least in the West, who understand the concept of Muslim and Islam, they're much more associated with the Islam that comes out of Saudi Arabia, which is what people refer to as the mainstream Islam, mainly because they had oil money and proliferated their philosophy, their cultural view as the mainstream Islam over the last 60 to 70 years. However, I like people to understand that there are many Islams with an S on it, because Islam as a faith, just like Christianity, there are many derivatives from it, and ours is derived from many instances through the culture in which it was derived. So if you're in Saudi Arabia, you're going to have a Saudi Arabian cultural understanding, but if you're in Syria, or say if you're in the Caucasus, from 1500 years ago, you're going to have it from that framework, or from China, or from Southeast Asia. The Islam sort of goes into the culture, associates with the things that are also there, and then its tenets sort of rise up, but the cultural things remain the same unless they go particularly against the Islamic tenets, one of them being like you shouldn't be worshiping anything other than the Abrahamic God, for example. So, but in places like Indonesia, for example, they had they had 4 different genders there. And so that continued, even though it's the largest Islamic country in the world. So the culture had it. Islam came in, they didn't find anything that was negative towards that, and therefore it is. However, the colonialism that came from the British colonizing Indonesia, for example, and Malaysia, they brought in their homophobia. And that's how those laws got instituted into those particular countries. But culturally, many times, the people continued to follow it, and it was usually the governmental people who would try to quash it. Let's see. So, I mean, do you want me to continue? Because I can do that.
Sure. I do have a question, though.
Okay, go ahead.
I believe it's India, you said had they recognized 4 genders. What were those 4 genders?
Well, there's actually the male, female, and then the same-sex women and same-sex men.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. You can continue.
In those latter 2, there are some derivatives as well.
Sure.
So that's how it sort of worked out. Now, generally speaking, progressive Islam, in my 25 years of promoting it, came from my studies, in-depth studies. For people, just for edification, many of the Islamic scholars that they may hear from some of the larger institutions, we all went to school together, study abroad, language courses, things like that. I went to Georgetown, others went to other schools, and we met in Egypt, we met in other places, different societies, and we studied together. But many of them went into academia. I decided to go into law because I had a thing for law and public interest. So I went into international public interest law as from the Islamic faith perspective. Mm-hmm. So, but many times, what happens is that too often they utilize what's known today, but they never go back to the true historical foundation. Whereas when Prophet Muhammad started Islam, there was a lot of opposition to him. The first couple of years, it was they said, "Oh, he's just another one of those, proselytizers and that type of thing." But as people started to pay attention to him, it started to affect the economic foundation of Mecca, which it was a pilgrimage place, had been for over 1,000 years before Prophet Muhammad had come. So what happened is that they started to fight against him because he was influencing how people were coming in. So they eventually ran him, out through subterfuge and even murdering some of the earlier Muslims. Prophet Muhammad sent his followers to the nexus, the king, the Egyptian king. I'm not the Egyptian, but the Ethiopian king, Christian king, for protection. So they wound up going there, and the Christian king protected the Muslims. And even though the paganist sent in said, "Hey, these people are criminals, send them back," he refused to, because he understood that they believed in the same Abrahamic God. And then during that 2-year period, Prophet Muhammad wound up going to Yathrib, which we call Medina today. And he had a treaty with the Jews, the Christians, and the pagans there who were warring with each other. And he says, "Okay, if y'all want me to come in as arbiter, then these are the rules. We have to sign a treaty. We'll protect each other, blah, 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 blah." And the Jews, Christians, and pagans had to support those Muslims who had lost everything. So when they came to Yathrib, they called them the Asar, the helpers. And they assisted the Muslims to become a viable religious community because without their help, Islam would not have thrived. And so I explained to people that being in the West is another manifestation of what it was 1,500 years ago, basically. That it was secular, very different groups, and Islam was able to prosper. So even in today's world, Islam should be able to prosper without him having a "we're superior to you" or "we're better than you" mentality. And so we're now at another nascent beginning of what does Islam mean for modern times, contemporary times, and into the future. Mm-hmm. Now, why do I say that? Cutting some things short, in some of my lectures, and one of them is actually a TED Talk, I asked the audience the question, In 100, 150 years from now, we're going to have human beings on other planets doing whatever they're going to be doing there. And I'm certain Muslims will be part of that group of human beings on those planets. So I lean into them and I ask them, I say, so for you Muslims out there, when it comes to prayer time, which way is Kaaba? And then they look at me and they're like, well, what's the question? What's the item? I say, I don't know, but the Muslims of that time will have figured it out. And I said, and considering my mathematical background and understanding of astronomy, I said, it's probably arching off one of the stars is the direction for Kaaba, you know? And then but the question is, which star will it be?
Uh-huh.
Well, what it does is challenges people to think beyond outside of the box of what we do today, or what have been done traditionally through tradition and customs, cultural customs today. How do we make that change? How do we stop utilizing patriarchal belief systems? For example, a woman is not a good woman if she does not wear hijab, you know, cover her hair, or wear niqab, cover her face. Well, all of that is cultural stuff and was actually there before Islam came on, but the culture picked up on it. Mm-hmm. That has nothing to do with the spirit and the intention of the human being that they're talking about.
Absolutely.
Quran encourages us to understand that we are all human beings. We're all created alike. Though we have great diversity on the outside, our tongues, our languages and tastes, our colors, our races and background, and our individual intellectual development. That's on the outside that shows. But then when we go to the inside, which they call in the Arabic, gharaib, the hidden, the unseen, then we also have our tastes and styles. We have our, for the tongues part. And then when we come to the colors, we all have different temperaments. Some people are sad and blue. Some people are yellow and cowardly. Some people are green with envy. Some people are, sad and blue. So we have our colors there as well. And when we started looking at that, and when I was doing this study, it took me about 6 months literally to go through all of this. You know how you let something sit in the back of your mind and one day, eureka, bus in Washington, D.C. when it hit me. And I was like, mashallah. And it just came to me, this is how we can have 8 billion people in the world. And just like our fingerprints, neither of us are exactly the same.
Absolutely.
Because of that combination of the outer and the inner. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when people manifest and say that they're transgender or any of the various, I don't know how many numbers of ways people have identified sexually now, was it 46 or something? Well, whatever the number is, we can be that and still be faithful to our particular religious.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So I hear it in everything that you're saying, but for the sake of people who may be on listening or who may come on later to listen, what is progressive Islam?
Okay. Progressive Islam is really the adjective progressive comes from a more secular perspective, meaning that we're advancing, we're moving forward, both in our cultural understanding of things, meaning that we as Americans or we as Westerners believe in that progression means to move forward. It means to think ahead, to be forward, modern thinking, and not so limited by our traditions and our customs. And therefore, Islam that is moving forward, Islam that is reevaluating what it means in modern contexts. Another adage I'll give you is that in Islam, they say that believe everybody but tie your camel, which is you probably heard in other ways as well. Well, the same thing is that we don't ride camels today. So the rules of camel riding, you don't run people over, do this and do that, are similar with our cars, but we don't ride camels. So we can take the intention, we can take the lessons from that and apply it to modern times, but we don't have to ride a camel in order to be adherent to the teachings of 1,500 years ago. And that's how I look at it, because like I said earlier, we're going to be in space and the prophet didn't live in space. So we have to come up with new ideas, new ways of understanding what the future will bring. And we can't be dependent on those older traditional things. Now I say that people who want to do that but their culture may have been doing it for the last 1,500 years. That's fine. Have no problems with that. But there must be space for us to be able to move our understanding of Islam into the future for modern day standards. Like, for example, legally, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, as I feel, is the minimum standard that Muslims must adhere to in order for us to be alive and working well in our contemporary times. We can't go back to the stuff that was 1,500 years ago, because back then there was slavery, there was sex slavery, there was murder, your owner could decide life and death for you, all these different things. Do we want that same kind of thinking today? I don't.
Right.
So it's that kind of thing. And then how women are perceived, how LGBTQ folks are perceived, how different races are perceived. You know, in the beginning of Islam, the first person the Prophet Muhammad asked to do the adhan, the call to prayer, ex-slave called Bilal. And, you know, he actually called for Bilal's freedom. The owner freed him. And then, because he said that in Islam, there is no slavery. And that it was better for people who own slaves to free them, to manumit, you know, them, than it was for them to continue that practice.
Sure. Wow. So how is progressive Islam received by the Muslim community, generally speaking?
Okay. Well, I have to say it's a mixed bag at the present time. But throughout time, there have always been progressive movements in Islam. Sorry, I got something in my eye there. Okay. For example, after the first 160 years or so of the Islamic faith, well, it's Arab control, which was the Umayyad period. We had the Abbasid period started. And from that time, basically from like 800 to around 1250, 1260, it was a period of great education and learning because the capital of Islam moved to Baghdad, which was Persian. And the Persians already had a long history of literature and things like that. So that expanded the way in which Islam was understood. And the emperors of that time, or emirs at that time, brought in people from all over the known conquered Islamic world, and they started educating themselves. They translated all the Greek and Roman materials so that we didn't lose that history. They expanded on medicine. They rewrote history in a number of different ways, but it was, of course, history is always written by the conquerors, but they were, they wound up giving a clear understanding of history that had been destroyed prior. You know, and so now the stuff that the European Reformation built upon came through Islam. So European thinkers back in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century studied Arabic and went to Andalus, to Granada, those places, because that's where they had the Islamic universities in Europe there. And that's where they learned. And then some would then travel to the Middle East later, and then they would gain more by going to Cairo, going to Baghdad, the universities that were there. And they had a thing called salon. The French word salon, where people would come and talk and discuss issues, well, it comes from the word saloon in Arabic, and salonat is the plural of that. And so they had different salons on different topics, subjects, you know, sciences, the medicine, history, all types of things like that. And these people from various parts, people who would be today in the Caucasians, like in Uzbekistan, or if they came from what we would call Northern India or Pakistan today, or for Iran and various places, these scholars came in and discussed things. I think something that the Westerners sort of have a thing is that the scholars would debate things to such an extent they could see how many angels can dance on the tip of a pin. You know, they were really contemplating things far beyond just, you know, how do we get to our next meal?
Yes.
And these things are written in if people had access to Arabic, they could see there was a lot of subject matters that were discussed that Western scholars followed up after they got, started their Reformation and got to extend themselves, like Darwinism. Mm-hmm. Well, Al-Razi, who was the one, I believe it was Al-Razi, who was the first one who talked about the thing of evolution and discussed those things. And there are drawings and stuff in the Arabic text and things like that. So it's not like new things didn't come up, but each civilization that expands picks up on what was left behind and then moves a little bit further.
Yes.
With it. So Islam has been part, or the Arab culture and Islamic faith have been part of that expansion of greater understanding of the Abrahamic faiths and how they can be derivatives of each other, but yet still hold very similar tenets that are there. For example, many people don't know that in Islam, we consider Jesus, we call him Isa in Islam, in Arabic, but Jesus is a prophet. We don't consider him God, but he is a prophet, like Moses. So he's one of the prophets. And we are just told that Muhammad was the last of the prophets because the Quran came as a quote unquote sealed document, because we had the Torah, and then we had the Bible, and then we had this the Quran. But the Quran came through an oral expression so that when it was written down, it became consistent. But what I found from the Quranic reading of the Quran, and the Quran says, is for you to read through your mind and your heart and build your personal relationship with God. You don't need anybody to be a leader, to tell you how to do things. Now, you can talk to scholars about subject matter, but when it comes down to the base connection, it's up to you and God. It's me and you, God, right?
Right. And hearing you say that, it helps illuminate the parallels of Christianity and Islam. So there are a lot of parallels, especially in what you just lifted. It also leads me to ask a question in regards to progressive Islam and Reformation. Like, what does that mean for folks who? So we know the Supreme Court of the United States, the SCOTUS decision just came down about abortion, right? Overturning Roe v. Wade. What does that mean to the progressive or the Islam community or the progressive Islam community in a moment that sounds like it's reforming and evolving as we speak?
Well, thank you. The thing is that I consider Islam to be the youngest sister of the Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Abrahamic faith line. Okay, so we're all sisters, and we learned from the older sisters, and then developed a process. Now, in terms to your question about, say, for abortion, well, just like in Judaism, Muslims also have a time period where we say that after 120 days, that God blows the spirit of life into the fetus. Hmm. It's at that point that is considered, I don't want to say a human being, but considered a spirit or a soul. Mm-hmm. If the mother should have to abort the child, actually the fetus is given a funeral after 120 days.
Understood.
But just like in Judaism, the emphasis is on the mother and her health and care. And if fetus is not viable, then abortion is permitted literally until the point where it could be viable. And during medical, and I don't have a whole lot of scholarship on this, but the medicine that the Muslims had, we were not using leeches to bloodlet and stuff like that. They were using a variety of different sources, herbs and things, plus psychological treatments to help people back during that time. Because the first hospitals were developed through the Islamic, in the 800. Common Era was when the first hospital opened in Baghdad. So it's been part of the process. I did some research, and it's on YouTube on Islam, medical marijuana, and Islam. And through my research, they used that back in the 800s in the psychiatric hospitals. They used marijuana as a way to deal with depression and psychological issues, as well as those who were dealing with pain. So the CBD oils, the marijuana, the THC stuff has been used literally since the 800s in helping with their medical situation. So as I said in my YouTube thing, it's not about getting high, it's about alleviating the pain that people may suffer from.
Absolutely.
Merciful.
Absolutely.
That's what it's about. And I tell people that I use CBD oils myself. I have arthritic condition, and sometimes when it hurts, I take me CBD oils and lay my behind down and rest. I remember about 2 years ago, about 3 years ago, I was at my brother's house in Denver, and he asked me to redo the marble floors. So I stripped them down and then put the white and all that, and I overdid it. And so later that day, I was like, oh, I'm really feeling, I took the CBD oil. About 2 hours later, I was still paining. So I had like some 5 milligram THC gummy bears. And I took one of those. By half an hour later, I took another one. It knocked me out. And when I woke up in the morning, I was feeling fine. So it wasn't about me getting high. It was making certain that I alleviated the pain and that I could move forward in terms of that.
Absolutely.
A total different framework, but so often people usually think that, oh, you're smoking marijuana, you want to get high. Well, no, that's not true. When I was a teenager, that was the goal, okay? It was breaking against the norms, But today it's about my health. It's about my physical capabilities to be able to function and not become a burden on other people. This is something that, like during the fasting period, during Ramadan, there are people who will, this is to show you the difference between culture and common sense, okay? I was up in Norway several years ago during the midnight sun period, okay? Where the sun basically barely goes below the horizon, then it rises again. So you get about 3 hours of dusk, but never night. And there was there were Somalians who were there, who were Muslim, who were trying to fast 22 hours a day. And so they asked me to talk to some of them, which I did. And I told them, I said, when you live in a place that the prophet did not live, because he lived on the equator, 15 and a half hours is the length of time that between sunset and sunrise there at that time in Medina. So anything beyond that, you're pushing it. So you shouldn't be fasting 22 hours, because after a week or so, you're going to get sick and then cause yourself physical problems. Now someone else, your wife, your sister, your brother, someone's going to now have to take care of you. You've just placed a burden on them. And I'm going to be a pious Muslim. No, you're not. You're being ignorant. You're now hurting someone else during their fast.
Right.
Conscious of your actions and not be so pious that you cause other people pain and suffering out of your own psychological sense of being, better. So it's those kinds of things that happen. So the culture says you're supposed to fast, and sun up to sun down. But the reality is that you're in a place where there is no night. So you're going to eat your meals in 3 hours and get up and prepare for the next day and drink enough water for the day. It's impossible.
Right.
So I'm just saying, those are some of the things, but people take that and the mythology that goes with it. Just like in Christianity, there's a mythology about Jesus. There's a mythology about the prophets and stuff. Well, in Islam, they have similar mythologies, but we have to learn to distinguish between mythology, feel-good stuff, Suleiman, when he fought against the Christian invaders and that he was a great warrior and all that, okay, yeah, that's cool. But war is not the thing we should be doing, because the Quran says avoid war. Find peace with people, So yeah, that myth is fine, but that doesn't mean that we're supposed to go around fighting everybody.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So it's common sense versus following the myth of custom and antiquity.
Yes. Wow, so interesting. You shared a lot that that will cause an awakening in a lot of people who had preconceived notions or assumptions about Islam, and hearing about progressive, right, Islam and the Reformation, like, yeah, it's going to cause an awakening. So, and just the things that you shared, and we appreciate that. So what about, I heard you, not going back to that question, but also staying in the vein of the progression and the evolving of Islam. We're talking about the four genders, right? And how it evolved to what it became versus it's coming out of the traditional ways of, how do you say that? It's coming out of the traditional male and female beliefs, where there were initially four genders that were acknowledged. Now there are 46. I heard you mention different ways that people identify. Where is progressive Islam now in terms of acknowledging and honoring LGBT people?
Well, the progressive community and liberal progressive community accept that people are identifying as who they are, and that they can still be Muslim with their sexual orientation, sometimes philosophical beliefs, and things of this nature, which people abide by. Okay. So this is where the mainstream community and the progressive community sort of diverge, because you have some Muslims who are more progressive, but they still don't believe that homosexuality is permissible in the faith. Well, those kinds of people, although I can get along with them on many different levels, I don't accept their interpretation of the Quran, because in my reading the Quran and looking at various things, there are places in the Quran, actual verses, that speak to non-heterosexual people. Some of it is allegorical, but some of it is straight in your face. For example, in chapter 24, verse 31, well, actually 30 through 32, it talks about men and women getting married, okay? Chapter 30, verse 30 tells them, men, stop gawking at women and lower your gaze, okay? Women, it said that these are the males you don't have to, veil before. Your brothers, their male children, your uncles, their male children, blah, 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 blah. So your male relatives you don't have to do. And men, male servants who do not have a desire for women. So I've heard people say, well, those are asexual people. I said, no. I said, men who have no desire for women have a desire for who?
Men.
Okay, so, and then he goes on to, and it further says that men who have no desire for women and children who have no knowledge about sexuality. So they don't have to, cover and all of that. Right. But then in verse 24:32, it says very clearly, and this is where the problem comes from, they put too many parentheticals in there to direct your attention a certain way, but it says, marry from the single among you. Then they put in parens, male and female, close paren, okay? When you read that verse, marry from the single among you. In Islam, a divorced woman is not bad. It's not bad, it's not looked upon. She was once married, it didn't work. She did her time period to make certain that she wasn't pregnant with the person's child, because if she was and they decided to divorce, he's responsible for the upkeep of that child. Okay? So they have that 90-day period to see if she's pregnant or not.
Understood.
Or if the husband disappears during war, after a certain period of time, she can ask for a divorce without his permission or agreement, because he's now unknown. We don't know what happened to him. So now she can then marry again to someone else. So it's those kinds of things that make the significant difference in how things are interpreted from the past and then to today. Now, in terms of LGBT people, the Ottomans in 1858 were the first ones during the time they call Tazimet period, which was the Muslims trying to catch up with the Europeans in terms of some of the modernizations, because they had literally cut themselves off for about 150 years. And they were the first ones to say homosexuality, it was not against the law in Muslim states. And it wasn't until 1958 when the British rejected the idea that homosexuality was criminal. So 100 years before that, the Muslims had that in their process. But as I said before, because of the leftover colonialist laws, those dictators and Muslim leaders who took over continued to use it as a source of power and control over the masses. So this is why the thing that, but in today's world, when I talk to them, I explain to them that because the Quran tells us or asks us that we all should get married, that we all have different temperaments and different ways in what we love, and that every human being has a mate. And when they use the term mate in Arabic, it means partner, mate, wife, spouse. So allegorically, you don't have to be a woman in order to be someone's partner, spouse, or that, because in today's world, there are many, 15 countries, I think, at least 15 countries that allow same-sex marriage. So you're fulfilling your requirement of marriage because now you can get married to who you want. Mm-hmm. I do want to say this. There's another scholar at UCLA's School of Law, Dr. Khalid El-Fadl. He's a great guy. And I heard him talk about the concept of marriage in Islam, and he made a very important point. In Muslim societies, when you have a marriage, it's the blending of two families. So the concept of same-sex marriage doesn't quite fit. But in Western cultures, where the idea is that two individuals are marrying, it fits perfectly well. Mm-hmm. And it's not because people who say, well, I was born this way. No, it's not that, because you can say anything. I was born this way in about anything. But it's that if you say that my best state of being is with a person of my same sex, for my comfort, for my cloak and protection, my sexual comfort, and ability to live life more fluidly, then it's permissible. Therefore, the concept of thinking through the process, we're not trying to make marriage like it is traditionally, but we're making marriage that applies to how we live our lives in modern times. Mm-hmm. And if we follow, and as long as it's legal, we're obeying the law.
Right.
Therefore, the freedom for marriage is there. Another thing too, I've always promoted, the last 25 years, I've been promoting that the UN Declaration of Human Rights is the standard we need to have. Mm-hmm. And through that process, we now have a large number of things that people can do that 1,500 years ago, 800 years ago, they didn't have.
Yes.
And Amina Wadud, who's another, Dr. Amina Wadud, who's another Islamic scholar, who I know very well, African-American professor and scholar, she talks about it from a feminist women's perspective about how things have changed over time, and that just because these rules were developed in patriarchal societies, we don't live in a patriarchal society in the same way. Therefore, we can't be applying the same rules without thinking through what are the things that are there and what are the things that are not there.
Right.
For example, outside of marriage sex, now that in Islamic law, there was a thing called zina. That was actually a heterosexual crime that if a married person had sex with someone that they were not married to, but didn't have they were their concubine or weren't their, second, third, or fourth wife, which was permissible, then it was outside of the law. So there was a punishment of zina, usually 80 lashes, and if it happened the second time, they would send you out of the community. You had to go someplace else to live. Okay, but that was heterosexually based. But the legal scholars of the time, in order to meet the needs of the ruling governors of the area, they said that sex not being married. Of course, same-sex people cannot get married because the law permits, doesn't permit them to do so. Then therefore they're committing zina or breaking the laws, and therefore they can punish them. And this is why you have, like in Iran and stuff, that they're throwing people off of buildings and hanging them and things like that, all based on a false interpretation. It has nothing to do with same-sex oriented people or people along the sexual spectrum.
Right.
I hope that made sense.
It did. It's a lot of amazing information. Like I said, people, from what we hear and read and see, when we haven't engaged, right? When we haven't had these type of conversations, there's a lot that we don't know. And so hearing you saying it is great information, a lot. One of the things that I heard you mentioned the date 1856, and then you mentioned 1958, where the British rejected the idea that homosexuality was wrong, basically.
Well, not wrong, but they decriminalized it.
Right. And so that's interesting to me, because in 1958 was when the British decriminalized it. But in 1946, the word homosexuality was added to the Bible. So it just seems like there was this war going on around, for lack of a better word, there was this interesting evolving of the fights that were happening around decriminalizing same gender love relationships or homosexuality, and the word homosexuality, or the context of homosexuality, being added to the Bible. So that's what's kind of going. I'm like, wow, it's really interesting, the timeline of that, right? So yeah, what you said absolutely made sense. The things that you're sharing is great information, is amazing information. So I asked this because progressive Islam is, for me, right, it sounds like progressive Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
While Christians see a decline, right, in those who identify as Christians, what is happening for youth or young adults when it comes to progressive Islam? Because progressive Islam, in the way that you have spelled some of the topics out, right, sounds like it would be attracting young people to progressive Islam. So have you seen that, or what's been the response of young people to progressive Islam?
Over the last 20 years, I've seen a growth in people better understanding themselves. Mm-hmm. Those who are born into a Muslim family tend to reject and call themselves ex-Muslims to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. Around 25% of Muslim youth who grew up in Muslim families will identify as ex-Muslim or culturally Muslim, but not necessarily faith-focused as being a Muslim.
Understood.
And from that, we have people now starting to mix, or I should say have mixed a secular philosophy in terms of psychological things and also secularism, mixing it with the concept of Muslim cultural things, and some people identify that way. But for others, it's always been a question of the Quranic framework. And through the work that I and others have done over the last 2 decades, they've come to accept themselves better. And it's like in my counseling, the families I did counsel, and I haven't had thousands of them, but I've had over 100 families that I've talked to, I found that around 55% of the mothers were accepting of their LGBTQ children, and around 45% of the fathers were also accepting.
Wow. But
the problem was public display of affection. Even heterosexuals don't have high levels of public displays of affection. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it's the cultural part sort of dictates how they understand that their LGBT children should be manifesting themselves as well. I had one in particular, I met with the father, and the son was a senior in high school. And he says, look, I understand my son is gay. I don't have any problems with it. Okay. He said, but the issue is that I own a supermarket in the Muslim community where they're from. He says if they find out that my son is gay, they would lose business, and that would influence his life and all of his siblings. So I asked him, I said, well, when he graduates from high school, what's going to, he says, I'm sending him to college so that he can become self-sufficient and everything. So I turned to the son and I said, look, I know you have a desire to want to be out. I said, but your father has just said to me, and I take that as a commitment, that he's going to send you to school so that when you go off to college, you can start your process of opening up. But also remember that when you're home, what you do can influence negatively upon your siblings, your parents and your siblings, and you don't want to do that. He says, no, I wouldn't want that to happen. So we were able to negotiate a process in which he was able to remain okay with who he is, mm-hmm. grow in that, mm-hmm. but he was cognizant of what things he could do at home and what things he could do when he was away from home. And I talked to him about 10 years ago, because this was about maybe 16 years ago. And I talked with him. He wrote me an email and says, hey, I graduated from college and blah, blah, blah. I have a partner now and blah, 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 blah. And everything well. That I said success. But I grew up in a family, and I knew a number of other Black and a few Latinos, because I grew up in Detroit. The auto industry people came from everywhere, so there's a big potpourri of people, if you will. And my parents were never negative towards me when I came out to them. They never told me something was wrong with me. They said, nothing's wrong with you. You have upheld all the standards we've had for your elder brothers. I come from a family of 9 children, 7 boys and 2 girls. And I've upheld all the standards that they had for all of the other kids, and there was nothing wrong with me. Of course, this is 1970. After the 69, gay rights movement. And my parents asked me, they said, well, did we do anything wrong? And I said, no, you didn't do anything. You did everything right.
Yes.
And so I grew up as a man-loving man and have never felt that I had to be a woman. I never felt that I had to be anything other than who I was. And with that support that they gave me, I went off to college. Because I graduated when I was 16. So I went off to college at 16. And I was able to live my life, understand I had standards to adhere to, and I was going to school. I mean, here I am at university, doing well in classes, carrying a 3.5, but I was still reading comic books, But some of the other students were drinking, smoking weed, all that kind of stuff. I didn't get caught up with that. Yeah. But I decided to come back home after my first year because the cultural atmosphere just wasn't right for me. Mm-hmm. So I came back home and got my own apartment and went to school and worked and all that kind of stuff. And that's how I continued to grow. And as I developed I've had 3 long-term partners, and I would bring them home, just like my parents, my other siblings did. And my parents accepted them, like my father and mother said one day. They said, oh, he's just another one of the boys. Come on in here, boy. And they gave him a big hug and everything and come on in. Right. Now, they didn't let us sleep in the bed together because they said, you're not married. I told them, no problem. We went out to the hotel, stayed. It was a good compromise, okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
But my parents loved me. They loved my partners and treated with no objection to treatment. They didn't have anything. I never heard them say anything negative, nor did any of my siblings report them saying anything negative about my life.
Oh, so awesome. So awesome. That's awesome.
I want to mention something real quickly. In 2015, one of the professors